Live from Washington, this is a news special, New Terror Threat.
Thanks for joining us on News Channel 8 and welcome to our audience on Sinclair Broadcast Group websites across the country. I'm Morris Jones. Tonight we take an in-depth look at the root causes of the terror attack in France and its impact on national security in the United States. In just a moment, we'll go live to Capitol Hill for an exclusive interview with House Armed Services Committee Chairman Mac Thornberry. But first, urgent new warnings at American airports. Authorities are concerned that al-Qaeda in Yemen, the same group behind the terror attacks in Paris, is plotting something in the U.S. Rebecca Cooper is in our newsroom with the latest. Rebecca.
Well, Morris, those new security measures at U.S. airports were made public on the same day victims at the kosher market in Paris were laid to rest in Israel. And troubling new video shows the moments after the Charlie Hebdo massacre. The newly released video is chilling. The Kouachi brothers brazenly shouting after killing their victims, "We have avenged the Prophet Muhammad," rearming and then easily outgunning Paris police. But today, in an act of defiance of their killers, survivors at Charlie Hebdo unveiled this week's cover, millions being sent to press with an image of the Prophet Muhammad crying, an image Muslim leaders warn will once again inflame sensitivities. This as U.S. officials announced new security measures for all U.S. airports, in part due to a publication from al-Qaeda leaders in Yemen. Inspire magazine, the latest edition, teaching step-by-step how to make bombs that could go undetected at many U.S. airports. Today at a White House meeting with congressional leaders, President Obama insists Democrats and Republicans can overcome the bitter divide in Washington, at least when it comes to the terrorist threat, particularly in the area of cyber attacks.
I've talked to both the Speaker as well as Mitch McConnell about this, and I think we agree that this is an area where we can work hard together.
But behind closed doors, one senior lawmaker briefed on the latest intelligence told us top officials simply don't believe the U.S. is ready, convinced there are now too many scenarios for a possible attack on U.S. soil. And on the Senate floor, John McCain was equally blunt, saying the U.S. isn't prepared to defeat one of the organizations attracting young radicals.
By the way, we have no strategy with which to degrade and defeat ISIS.
Now, Morris said all U.S. airports expect tightened security, including more random bag checks. Experts say the big risk is for smaller airports. Many do not yet have the type of screening equipment they need to detect the kind of bombs that al-Qaeda is urging its followers to make and use. Morris, back to you.
Rebecca Cooper, thank you. For reaction to the elevated terror threat and other issues, let's go to Capitol Hill. Republican Representative Mac Thornberry, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, is standing by. Mac, there's a lot of distance between France and the United States. That said, last week's attack prompted increased security at our nation's airports. Just minutes ago, lawyers for the Boston Marathon suspect asked the judge to suspend jury selection because of the Paris attacks. Is there an imminent threat, do you think, and should Americans be overly concerned?
Well, Americans should not be overly concerned, but we should be concerned because all of those thousands of people who have traveled to either Iraq, Syria, and a few to Yemen from Western Europe can come to the United States without a visa. And so that's part of the reason that there is such a heightened state of alert. There have been so many people who have traveled there and traveled back. It's our law enforcement intelligence folks can't keep track of all their movements.
Now, yesterday you were on CNN talking about France, ISIS, and cybersecurity. You called cyber the new domain of warfare. This on the heels of yesterday's hack of U.S. Central Command's Twitter and YouTube sites. Tell us more.
Well, I think there's no question. We have seen just in the past few days, not only this group that hacked the Twitter site of the Central Command, but North Korea, who, to carry out their policies, got into Sony. And we have seen repeatedly the Chinese stealing information from us. So it can certainly get more serious than that. And it's not just the Russians, the Chinese, the North Koreans. We have seen the Iranians, civilians as well as now terrorist groups who are using cyber. They're looking for weaknesses to attack our country and to advance their cause. So part of what happened yesterday was not only to show they could, but it was to strike fear into those military folks who were afraid their personal information was being revealed, and therefore the terrorist group tried to get some intimidation factor into it. So this struggle is not just about shooting people and blowing people up like we saw in Paris. There's also a psychological warfare part of it.
You're exactly right. Mac, does Congress really understand this issue?
Not fully, and the truth is we need to do more to see whether we're really winning this global struggle against the terrorists, part of which is happening in cyberspace. So we have more work to do. We also have more work to do to see what we expect the government to do to defend private networks. Right now, they're not doing much at all.
Now, in your interview, you seem to suggest that hurdles to surveillance, like the disclosures by Edward Snowden, are making the U.S. less secure. Let's listen.
I think we the West, know less today about terrorists and what they're planning than we did just a few years ago, because there have been so many leaks, books, movies, and the like. The terrorists have learned what we do and how we do it, and in addition to that, we've tied our own hands for some crucial intelligence collection. So the point is, we have less information about these folks, where they've gone, what they plan, than we did a few years ago. That's part of the reason I think the danger is higher today than it's been before.
Congressman, that's what you told the country yesterday. Now clarify that point for us tonight. Are you arguing for wide-scale surveillance or limiting freedom of speech?
Oh, of course not. It's always a balance. But I do think we've gone too far. And we've gone too far, to score political points with all these books and movies. Snowden has done enormous damage to this country illegally, but he still told the terrorists what we do and how we do it, as well as these other leaks that we've suffered. So as a result, the terrorists know more about us, and we know less about them because we have tied our hands from the sort of information collection that we were doing just a few years ago. So you take that and you couple it with the fact that now we have more terrorist threats in more places to worry about, and I really do believe the danger is greater now than it was just a few years ago.
Now, President Obama is now proposing cyber legislation. Senator McCain says he's guardedly optimistic about it. What do you think?
The House passed cyber legislation in 2012. The House passed cyber legislation in 2013. We are anxious to have a partner on the other side of the Capitol and in the White House who'll work with us on this. I think it's important to emphasize, though, that what the White House is talking about is just a tiny first step. We have so much more work to do in this area of cyber in order to really make the country safer.
All right, let's go back to France. Congressional Republicans have criticized the Obama administration for failing to send a high-level representative to the Unity March in Paris over the weekend. Was that a significant diplomatic mistake?
I think it was a significant mistake. They've tried to correct it by saying, okay, we made a mistake and whatnot. But the key was the world is looking to the U.S. for leadership. And are we really there? Are we leading from behind, or are we missing in action? That's what the world is looking at. And I think it is important to emphasize that however impressive that demonstration was, it's going to take more than marches to stop terrorists. It's going to take intelligence, law enforcement, and strong military action too.
Now, Mac, on Twitter, one of your colleagues and fellow Texas Republican Representative Randy Weber compared President Obama to Adolf Hitler for missing that rally. Weber has a history of inflammatory remarks, and he apologized and deleted the tweet. Do you think he should step down?
Well, I think that was totally inappropriate. He should have apologized, and that, people on both sides get carried away with their own rhetoric, and that does not help us make the country safer, and that has got to be our goal.
All right, before we go, you will lay out your agenda for the House Armed Services Committee next Tuesday during a speech at the American Enterprise Institute. Did the attack in France prompt any changes to your plan?
No, not at all. Congress has a central role under our Constitution to provide the military capability that the President, as Commander-in-Chief, then directs. And one of the big challenges we have for the future is cyber, another one is terrorism, and we have many more besides, including Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, etc. And so we have to find a way to work together to deal with this huge array of complex threats facing our country.
What do you want? What's your takeaway from all of this that we've seen the past couple of weeks, and now with the Twitter attacks, ISIS, and everything else that they're doing? Should we be worried or concerned about any wide-scale cyber threat here in this country besides the normal terrorism threat that we're always talking about?
Yeah, we should be worried about it, and it's not just the terrorists who are looking for vulnerabilities. I think the big takeaway of the past week is that the terrorists are a flexible, adaptable enemy looking to exploit our vulnerabilities. They're always learning, always changing, always adapting, looking for the weak spots. And we're going to have to be more agile in dealing with them if we're going to be successful against this worldwide movement that includes Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and others.
Chairman Mac Thornberry, thanks for being with us tonight.
You're welcome.
For reaction and analysis from a political and a national security perspective, let's turn to our next guest on this news special, The New Terror Threat. Joining me, Richard Fowler, Democratic strategist and host of the nationally syndicated Richard Fowler Show. Also, J.J. Green, national security correspondent at WTOP Radio in Washington, D.C. J.J., I'd like to start with some reaction. What surprised you about Thornberry's comments, and what do you consider to be significant from what you heard?
No surprises. Significance, terrorists know a lot more about us than they used to.
And they're patient.
And a part of it has to do with the leaks in the books that he talked about. But the one thing that's very clear, and he kind of alluded to this, Americans can't allow themselves to fall into the trap that terrorists want us to, and that is to be surprised, and that is to be shocked and stunned and scared, because that's a big part of what terrorists do. Regardless of the bombs and the guns, it's all about messages, subtle messages that get inside your head that make you scared. So that's one of the key things, one of the key takeaways from his discussion with you that I picked up on immediately.
And Richard, Thornberry is considered a moderate Republican. You heard his take on the Obama administration no-show at this weekend's Unity rally in France. Did you agree with him?
Well, listen, I think there was a big blunder by the White House by not sending somebody to the rally. I think, the press secretary said it again today, that we made a mistake here, right? And now the question is, how do we fix it? And I think the president laid out a clear plan on how we deal with cybersecurity in the next coming weeks. He's also having a summit at Stanford University to figure out what we can do, both from the business side, from the academic side, from the government side, to make sure that all Americans stay safe, both cyber as well as just regular terrorism. And so I think it's a step in the right direction for this president after a big misstep this weekend.
Do you think it was just that, or they weren't sure who to send? I mean, Biden was free, but they talk about all this extra security. The Attorney General was over there in the region. The Secretary of State didn't want to call off any meetings with Modi in India. Or do you think they just couldn't figure out who to place there because they would be criticized regardless?
Oh, listen, I think it's definitely a tough needle to thread, Morris, but I do believe that this White House made a big blunder. They could have sent the Vice President. They could have sent the Secretary of State. They could have sent Eric Holder, who happened to be in the city. And I think they've owned up to that mistake. The question is now, what do they do to fix it? And part of that means international cooperation in dealing with terrorism.
JJ, you and I have talked before about the concern over lone wolf attacks. Do the killings at Charlie Hebdo fit into that category, or do they have deep roots that might lead back to the U.S.?
Brilliant question. No, it doesn't fit into the traditional lone wolf scenario, and yes, it could end up being some significant baggage for the U.S., and here's why. These two Kouachi brothers demonstrated very discriminate motivations when they went into the building and killed the journalist and the policeman there. But why didn't they kill the woman that opened the door? Why didn't they kill the man whose car they stole? Why did they let him politely get his dog out of the car and leave? And why did they kill the policeman on the street, but why did they rob the gas station and not kill the attendant? This is one of the confusing scenarios that we may see more often of in the future. Terrorists that, or people that essentially adhere to an ideology, but don't necessarily adhere to the way in which that ideology is traditionally carried out. It's basically a new type of terrorist, a hybrid, that we may see more of in the future.
Problem is, a hybrid, they were trained. They knew how to use the weaponry. They singled out who they wanted to use. They just weren't going off on their own as a lone wolf would.
Well, that's what makes them a hybrid.
With the training, right?
Well, that's what makes them a hybrid. They have certain pieces of what's necessary to be a terrorist, but they're not acting like a traditional terrorist. I was talking with Michael Chertoff, former Homeland Security Secretary, not too long ago, and he talked about how we won't necessarily see the typical terrorist with the wild look in their eyes like we used to. These people are going to look just like and act like just like the rest of us until they decide it's time to push the button.
I'd like to get back to the topic of cyber for a moment. For now, it appears to be the most immediate threat inside the United States, especially if you consider the hacks against Sony and U.S. Central Command. Here's President Obama speaking today.
It just goes to show how much more work we need to do, both public and private sector, to strengthen our cybersecurity, to make sure that families' bank accounts are safe, to make sure that our public infrastructure is safe. I've talked to both the Speaker as well as Mitch McConnell about this, and I think we agree that this is an area where we can work hard together.
All right, Richard, you heard Chairman Thornberry's position on this bill. Can Congress compromise and pass cyber legislation after years of kicking the can down the road?
I think they actually can, Morris. I think for once, this is the big sort of anticipation that we've all been waiting for. This ideal of with divided government we'll actually get something done. And I think this is a great opportunity for both Mitch McConnell and John Boehner to show that they can govern, and for this president to sort of take the reins back here. If he can get this through this Congress, and I think that there seems to be an appetite for it on the Republican side, and there's an appetite for it on the Democratic side, there's an appetite for it at the White House, means we can get it done. The question is what's going to be in the bill? And I think that's the larger conversation that we have to have. The president's going to want increased spending for security. Will Republicans give him that spending? Will Republicans want to put more money in the Pentagon? And the president will put more money in Homeland Security? And that's really going to be the big debate moving into the next, the next phase of this Congress. But I got to tell you the truth. The truth is I would rather see this Congress debate cybersecurity than another long drawn-out debate about the Keystone Pipeline, which we know won't work, right? Because this is what America voted for. They voted for a government that's going to keep them safe, and they also voted for a government that's going to make sure that their family's safe. And Keystone has nothing to do with either of those.
JJ, Senator McCain called the CENTCOM hack embarrassing. Could it have been damaging as well? How far does this go?
Let's keep this in perspective. It was embarrassing, but everybody gets hacked on Twitter. Everybody gets hacked on YouTube. And that's what happened. The YouTube account was hacked and the Twitter account was hacked. And some of this information regarding addresses and names of certain of the generals and public officials with CENTCOM, this was public information already. So we don't know where they got it. But the point that it needs to be made right now, it's embarrassing, and CENTCOM doesn't want this kind of scenario taking place and happening. But what's more concerning to them right now is the millions of people in the military who have these Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube accounts and are posting personal information on there that might lead some terrorist or some deranged person to them. So this is really what's happening right now, is they're trying to get them to scrub their accounts or even shut them down.
We knew it was going to happen. Remember when the French warned about this a few days ago and told all their service members to take down their accounts?
And the Pentagon's been warning, and police have been warning in bulletins for months. You need to think about scrubbing or shutting down your accounts.
Makes sense. Before we wrap up, I'd like to get a takeaway from you, Richard. Let's start with politics. We've been talking about the new threat and the various forms that it takes. What do you think various leaders watching this program tonight here in Washington should take away from all of this?
Well, here's one thing that everyone needs to take away. What needs not to happen this time is what happened 9/11, where we basically went to the archives, we took a mallet to our Constitution, and we said we're going to destroy freedom through the Patriot Act and not be Americans. The best way to defeat terrorism is by continue living your life, right? Continue living without fear of terrorists coming. The terrorists, they thrive off fear. That's what makes them grow. That's why they self-radicalize. And also, we need to have an honest discussion about xenophobia in this country. When you have constant talk about, radical Islam, and they make it seem as though everybody who happens to be Islamic or Muslim is a terrorist, that's a huge problem. But with all those things being said and done, there is work that this Congress can do together to make sure that all Americans are safe, right? This needs to happen on both the state, national, and local level. It's everybody working together, everybody having a conversation about how we fix it. And this goes beyond politics. This should be a bipartisan issue. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat, Republican, or Independent. This is an American issue.
It's good to get your insight. Richard Fowler, host of The Richard Fowler Show, and J.J. Green, national security correspondent with WTOP Radio. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's shift our focus from the political and national security implications here at home to the impact that the Paris attack is having around the world. Today, France's Prime Minister announced he will seek tighter surveillance of convicted extremists and warned the French to keep up their guard. Joining me with more is J.D. Gordon, a retired Navy commander, former Defense Department spokesman, and executive director of Protect America Today. Also, Heather Conley, director of the Europe program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. J.D., I'd like to start with you. Authorities killed the Kawachi brothers and their friend at the Jewish market last week, but this investigation is far from over. Just today, reports emerged that the weapons used in the attacks came from outside the country. What's the latest that you're hearing, and what are investigators looking for?
Well, Morris, the latest is that this plot could have involved up to 10 people. It was hatched possibly up to 3 years ago. We knew initially that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was involved. One of the Kawachi brothers had actually been in Yemen in 2011. He was training there with jihadists. He had met Anwar al-Awlaki, a spiritual leader of Al-Qaeda. And also he apparently roomed with Abdul Muttalab, who is the Nigerian guy who is the underwear bomber on that flight that tried to blow up a commercial airliner over Detroit. So small world. I think that the police are going to be looking for any other suspects they might be able to find. They need more surveillance. They need to be able to track these guys and their associates. This was known to a lot of people, apparently, and so I hope the French authorities can track these guys down before you have more attacks.
Known to a lot of people, but the tracking stopped 6 months ago. I mean, they either not enough people. That's the big investigation now in Paris, is why the surveillance stopped. Heather, the killing shocked the French Jewish community of 500,000 people, the largest in Europe. They say rising anti-Semitism and threats from Muslim extremists are nothing new. Tell us more.
They're absolutely right. Sadly, there have been an increase, a real dramatic uptick in events that can only be explained as anti-Semitic. In July of last year, a Jewish-owned pharmacy in Paris was firebombed as a direct relationship to the Gaza war. In March of last year, 4 were killed outside the Jewish Museum in Brussels, allegedly by a French jihadist. There has been a growing climate of fear and intimidation of the Jewish community in France, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, and elsewhere. And the tragedy of the last few days just really highlights this growing climate of fear.
Meanwhile, officials in Israel are expecting and encouraging a new influx after the Paris violence. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke at the Great Synagogue of Paris on Sunday. I'd like to read part of his address. You have the full right to live in safety and tranquility as citizens with equal rights wherever you wish, including here in France. But Jews of our time have been blessed with the right to join their Jewish brothers and sisters in our historic homeland. Some world leaders criticized Netanyahu for that statement and for his appearance at the Paris rally. What do you make of it, J.D.?
Well, I think Israel has a real demographic challenge ahead of it. There are more Palestinians having children than Israeli Jews. So I think that Netanyahu is trying to encourage people to move to Israel to help shift that balance in his favor. I also think that he should have attended the rally. I think it was entirely appropriate. I think it was a good message that he attended, as well as Abbas, who heads the Palestinians. So I think to see all those world leaders, including Netanyahu and including Mahmoud Abbas there, was a positive sign for the world.
The attack is also fueling an anti-Islamic movement in Europe. Far-right groups like France's National Front and Germany's Pegida. Heather, what do these groups stand for, and are they dangerous?
Well, there's sort of two forces at play here. You have sort of this traditional far-right anti-Semitic sentiment that has been in Europe for centuries, and it's now clashing with an increasingly far-left sentiment that is very anti-Israel. It's against Israel's actions in the Middle East. So in some ways, both of these forces are colliding. In many ways, the Middle East conflict has been imported into Europe. So when tensions flare in the Middle East, we see a dramatic uptick, as we did last year, in anti-Semitic incidents. And the Jewish community feels in some ways it has no place to go. It appeals to the authorities for enhanced security measures, but in France, many French Jews are afraid to even show any symbols of their Jewish faith. That's the level of fear and intimidation. So many are calling here in the U.S. to welcome European Jews to the United States, very similar to what we did in the collapse of the Soviet Union, that this fear of intimidation and this climate of fear is really calling all to welcome the Jewish community to Israel or to the United States.
Now, I'd like to talk about the potential domino effect. The Obama administration doesn't have a shortage of international priorities at the moment, like Russian aggression, the civil war in Syria, nuclear negotiations with Iran, and ISIS. What should we watch for? JD, you first.
I think all of those, Morris. I think number one, we have to look at this radical Islamic terrorism by groups like the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram. That's the first threat because they could strike here pretty easily. Number two, and even though it's a bigger threat long term, number two is Iran's nuclear program. I think if Iran has a nuclear weapon, that could make 9/11 look like child's play. But for right now, the immediate threat today, tomorrow, next week is certainly this radical Islamic terrorism from the Sunni branch. Then after that, I would focus on Iran and the Shia extremism.
Heather, what are your priorities on your radar?
Well, we're going to have to walk and chew gum. We have a multitude of international crises. We have in Russia a state actor that is completely flouting international legal norms by annexing Crimea, destabilizing eastern Ukraine. It is a power with nuclear weapons that is threatening European security. We also have a non-state actor, the Islamic State, that is also trampling international laws and norms, and we have to face that threat, both from a homegrown terrorism element, but as well as further destabilization of the Middle East. We can't take our eyes off China either. Here you have a rising power that's also challenging international norms in the South China Sea. So whether we like it or not, we are going to have to be extremely active, proactive, and vigilant around the world, and making sure that there's strong American leadership, and hopefully when there's more opportunities like the Paris March solidarity, that there will be a strong demonstration of U.S. leadership to demonstrate that solidarity.
Heather Conley with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, J.D. Gordon, Executive Director of Protect America Today. Thanks to you both.
Thank you.
Thanks, Morris.
And that's the latest tonight from Washington. Thanks for being with us. Join us on Thursday from Washington and on Sinclair Broadcast Group websites around the country. We'll look at how the new terror threat also impacts free speech around the world. We'll talk with Nick Kosar, an internationally known editorial cartoonist who fled Iran after being jailed for a political cartoon. Guest panelists from the Museum, CARE, and Freedom Press also speak out about freedom of speech in the face of terrorism. Until then, I'm Morris Jones. Good night.